The night Clara went into labor began quietly, wrapped in a peaceful calm that felt almost unreal after weeks of storms. Yet beneath that calm, strange uneasiness tugged at her, a tension low in her belly she tried to ignore as she folded tiny clothes on the bed. Clayton was outside shutting the chicken coop for the evening, humming a low tune she had begun to recognize as something he did only when he felt content. She smiled at the sound, pressing a hand to her belly, whispering to her baby that they were safe, that everything would be all right. But as she reached down to place a little knitted bonnet in the cradle, a sharp pain clamped around her like a sudden bolt of lightning, stealing her breath. She froze, one hand gripping the bedpost, the other clutching her stomach as warmth flushed through her body, and the next contraction hit even harder. Her voice trembled as she called Clayton's name, a soft call at first. But when another wave of pain surged through her, sharper, faster than she expected, her call became a cry. Clayton burst through the door within seconds, eyes wide with fear that sliced straight through his calm. "Clara!" he breathed, and she could only shake her head, tears springing to her eyes as another contraction twisted her insides. She saw panic flicker across his face, that old terror of loss threatening to surface, but he swallowed it down, forcing steadiness into his voice. "It's all right, I've got you. I'm right here," he said, even as his hands trembled while he helped her to the bed. The labor came fast too fast. Clara struggled to breathe between waves of pain that crashed over her with frightening intensity. Clayton wiped sweat from her brow, stroked her hair back, whispered encouragement into her ear, and squeezed her hand so tightly she could feel the warmth of his strength holding her together. At one point she screamed, fear rising like a dark tide, and he pulled her close, pressing his forehead against hers. "Look at me," he whispered hoarsely. "You're not alone. I won't let anything happen to you. I swear it." She clung to his voice, to the fierce determination burning in his eyes that had once watched helplessly as tragedy took everything from him, but now burned with a promise he refused to break. Hours blurred into frantic breaths, whispered prayers, and Clayton holding her through every moment she thought she might shatter. And then, just when she thought she had no strength left, a tiny cry broke through the night, thin, wailing, perfect. Clara collapsed back onto the pillows, sobbing with relief as Clayton lifted the squirming newborn into his hands. His breath hitched, his shoulders shaking as he stared at the tiny life he held. When he placed the baby into Clara's arms, tears streamed openly down his face. "You did it," he whispered brokenly. You're both here." Clara looked up at him, seeing not just a rescuer or protector, but a man being healed in real time, healed by the miracle he thought life would never give him again. And, as their baby's cries softened into tiny hiccups, Clayton gently cupped Clara's cheek, his voice trembling with awe. "You've given me back everything I lost," he breathed. And in that moment, exhausted, tear-streaked, holding new life between them, they both knew nothing would ever be the same. In the weeks that followed the baby's birth, the ranch transformed in ways Clara never could have imagined. The once silent rooms, now filled with the soft rustling of blankets, the gentle sighs of a newborn sleeping, and the quiet laughter that began to weave itself into her days like sunlight settling on warm earth. Clayton moved through the cabin with a tenderness that still surprised her. This big, rugged cowboy who once lived like a ghost, now carried the baby with such careful devotion that it made her chest ache every time she watched him. He would cradle the little boy against his chest, humming low steady melodies that soothed both child and father, his broad hands dwarfing the tiny bundle they held as though he were guarding a treasure too precious to touch without reverence. Clara found herself falling into a new rhythm, one that didn't revolve around fear or survival but simple moments of peace. The way Clayton would quietly leave fresh flowers on her windowsill each morning, the way he'd take the baby at dawn so she could rest, or how he'd glance at her with a softness that said more than any words could. She realized she'd begun to look for him, his footsteps, his warm presence, the deep calm in his voice, and every time their eyes met across the room, something warm and bright flickered between them. Yet even as their bond deepened, a tiny thread of uncertainty tugged inside her. One evening, after she put the baby down to sleep, she stepped onto the porch where Clayton stood staring out at the fading horizon, the sky washed in pink and gold. He looked almost nervous when he turned toward her, his hat in his hands, his expression guarded yet hopeful. "Clara," he began, voice low, "I need to say something I've been carrying for a while now." Her heart fluttered in her chest, fear and hope tangling in one breath. He stepped closer, the dying light catching the softness in his features. "I don't want you to stay because you owe me anything," he said, The words gentle but raw. I want you to stay because you want this. Because you want. U.S. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from a joy so deep it felt like relief. She took a breath, reached for his rough, warm hand, and placed it against her cheek. Clayton, she whispered, I chose you long before I had the courage to admit it. I stayed because being here with you feels like home. His eyes closed for a moment, as if he were absorbing the truth into his very soul. And when he opened them again, they shone with something new, a quiet, steady joy. He cupped her face gently, reverently, and kissed her softly at first. Then with a depth that spoke of all the pain they'd survived and all the love they were ready to share. Behind them, the baby let out a tiny coo from inside the cabin, and both of them laughed softly, leaning their foreheads together. In that moment, as the warm glow of evening wrapped around their little family, Clara realized that the life she feared losing had simply been waiting to begin, and it had begun here in the arms of the man who had found her on a lonely trail and shown her that love could rise out of brokenness, stronger and more beautiful than she ever believed possible. In the calm that followed the storm, Clara sensed a shift in Clayton, a heaviness in his eyes, a hesitation in his movements, as though some long-kept truth pressed at the edges of his silence, begging to be spoken. For days he had been her strength, the steady hands that guided her through fear and exhaustion. But now she felt him withdrawing, not out of coldness, but out of a deep, quiet torment that shadowed every word he didn't say. One evening as the fire crackled low in the hearth, and the sky outside blushed with fading gold, Clayton finally lowered himself onto the wooden bench across from her, his posture tense, his fingers twisting a small leather strap he seemed unaware he was holding. Clara felt the air thicken with unspoken grief. He stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking, his voice rough, as though it had scraped against old wounds. There's something you should know, he began, and the weight in those 6 words made her breath still. He told her about the wife he once loved, a gentlewoman with a laugh that used to fill this same cabin, and the child. They had been expecting the child whose tiny blanket still lay tucked away in an old chest he hadn't dared open in years. He spoke of the accident on a storm-slick trail, the runaway horse, the desperate race to reach them in time, and the crushing failure that haunted him still. As he spoke, emotion flickered across his face, sorrow sharpened by guilt, love softened by regret. Clara felt each word sink into her heart like stones dropped into deep water. He admitted that he had blamed himself for their deaths, had punished himself by living alone on this ranch, convinced he didn't deserve another chance at happiness, another chance to protect someone who depended on him. When he looked up at her eyes, glistening with a pain he no longer tried to hide, she saw the vulnerable truth he had been guarding. That the moment he found her struggling on the trail, something old inside him awakened an instinct to save, to shield, to step in where no one else had. But, with that instinct, had come fear. Fear that he would fail again. Fear that caring for her would break him. I can't lose you, he whispered now, voice trembling with a sincerity that stole the breath from her lungs. Even if I'm not sure I deserve to keep you safe. Clara reached for his hand before she even knew she was moving, her fingers brushing the roughness of his knuckles. In that simple touch, she felt the truth. He didn't dare speak. He had already grown attached, not out of pity, not out of duty, but because something in her had called to the wounded protective soul inside him. And as he lowered his head, exhausted by his confession, Clara's heart tightened with a mix of sorrow and hope. Maybe they were both broken, but maybe, just maybe, they were broken in ways that fit together. In the gentle days that followed Clayton's confession, something unspoken but unmistakable settled between them, a new warmth, a quiet gravity that drew their wounded hearts closer, even when neither dared reach too far. Clara felt it, in the way his voice softened whenever he spoke her name, in the way his eyes lingered on her, just a heartbeat longer before he looked away, as though afraid she might see how deeply he already cared. And Clayton felt it, too, in the soft steadiness of her presence, in the way she filled the empty cabin with humming while she cooked, or the way her smile flickered like candlelight when he entered the room. Their lives began to intertwine, not through grand gestures, but through small, tender moments that slipped into the routine of ranch life as naturally as breathing. Clayton rose early each morning, quietly stoking the fire before she woke, so the cabin would be warm for her and the baby. When Clara stepped outside to gather laundry or sit in the morning sun, he always appeared nearby, not hovering, not controlling, but close enough that she never felt alone on the vast land that had once been his silent prison. Sometimes she caught him watching her as she rubbed her swollen belly, his expression full of untamed longing and fear and something gentler, something like hope. And though Clara tried to convince herself she shouldn't lean on him too much, shouldn't let her heart soften toward him, she found it happening anyway. She found it in the way her breath caught when he brushed a strand of hair behind her ear without thinking. She found it in how safe she felt when he handed her a cup of tea with both hands, careful not to let it burn her. She found it in the laughter they shared one afternoon when the barn cat chased her own tail until she toppled over, and Clara's laughter spilled out so unexpectedly that she covered her mouth, embarrassed only for Clayton to say softly, "It's good to hear you laugh again." The tenderness in his voice undid her. Their closeness deepened, not through romance, but through healing through to broken souls, learning, slowly, that the world had not ended with their losses. One sunset, as she stood on the porch watching the sky bleed into shades of amber and rose, Clayton stepped beside her, close enough that the heat of his arm warmed her own. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. When a gentle breeze lifted the loose tendrils of her hair, Clayton instinctively reached out to smooth them back, his fingers brushing her cheek in a tender sweep that stole her breath. He froze the moment he realized what he'd done, but Clara didn't pull away. That single, accidental touch was enough to let them both know that something fragile yet powerful was taking root between them, something neither had expected, but both silently longed to nurture. And in that golden hush, with the sun sinking behind the hills and the quiet of evening wrapping around them, they each understood that love wasn't crashing into them, it was growing, slow and steady, like a seed planted in the ashes of the past, reaching toward the promise of something brighter. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm settled into the ranch, soft as dusk light, slipping through pine branches, and Clara found herself moving through it with a strange blend of caution and comfort, as though her wounded heart didn't quite trust the peace being offered, but couldn't resist leaning toward it all the same. Clayton Reed kept his distance, at first not cold, not withdrawn, just cared for, like a man afraid to break something fragile. He spent mornings tending the horses and repairing the parts of her wagon she thought were beyond saving. His sleeves rolled up, revealing strong, sun-browned arms that moved with the calm certainty of someone who had spent most of his life mending broken things. Every so often she'd catch him glancing toward the cabin window, making sure she was all right, and each time their eyes met, he looked away quickly, as if ashamed of being caught caring. Clara, for her part, tried to help with small tasks, folding laundry, sweeping the porch, preparing simple meals, but her body tired fast, and whenever she paused to catch her breath, Clayton would appear silently, offering a stool, a glass of water, or simply his steady presence. What surprised her most were the little gestures she kept discovering. A freshly carved wooden spoon left by her bedside, a jar of jam she hadn't seen him buy, or make a small knitted blanket, folded neatly with her unborn child in mind. None came with explanations or expectations. They simply appeared, like he had wordlessly woven her and her baby into the fabric of his home. And though the air between them was still lined with uncertainty, something tender began to grow there too, something that warmed the space whenever their hands brushed accidentally, whenever she laughed softly at one of his rare but honest comments, or whenever she felt his gaze linger on her just a heartbeat longer than necessary before he turned away. One afternoon, as she sat outside on the porch, her swollen feet propped on a small stool he'd built in one evening, she watched him working in the corral, his silhouette framed against the open sky. There was a loneliness about him, one she recognized too well. It was the same quiet ache she carried behind her ribs, the ache of someone who had loved deeply and lost painfully. She wondered what grief lived behind his silent kindness, what memories weighed down his shoulders when he thought no one was watching, and without meaning to, she found her heart softening toward him, drawn to the gentleness he tried so hard to hide. She didn't want it, didn't ask for it, but it came anyway, blooming slow and steady, like wildflowers pushing through hard soil. And though they never spoke of it aloud, both of them knew something was changing, something neither of them had expected, but both were beginning to crave. The storm rolled in just after dusk, sweeping across the valley with a violence that rattled the cabin windows and made the old pine trees groan under the weight of the wind, and as thunder boomed overhead, Clara felt something inside her finally snap the thin thread of strength she'd been clinging to since the day she buried her husband. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling in her lap, trying to steady her breaths, but the storm outside only echoed the storm inside her. Fear of the future, fear of giving birth alone, fear that she was a burden, a stray he had taken in out of duty rather than choice. Her chest tightened painfully, and before she could stop herself, silent tears began streaming down her cheeks, dripping onto her dress in dark, shaky circles. She pressed a hand over her mouth, desperate not to be heard. But grief had a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks. Clayton, who had been sitting by the dying fire, sharpening tools with quiet focus, lifted his head the moment he heard her muffled sob, and something in his expression usually so controlled shattered. He stood slowly, as if afraid of frightening her, and walked to her door before pausing with his hand hovering near the frame. "Clara?" he sighed softly, the storm rumbling behind his voice like distant grief. She didn't answer, ashamed of her weakness. But another sob escaped her, betraying everything. That was all it took. Clayton stepped inside, hat off, eyes full of more worry than she'd ever seen in a man. She tried to turn away, wiping at her face like a child caught crying in church, but he knelt beside her bed without hesitation. "You don't have to hide this," he murmured. And there was something raw in his voice, something that told her he understood this kind of breaking. When she finally looked at him, her tears unstoppable, he didn't offer empty promises or hurried comfort. He simply reached out, slow and gentle, his calloused hand covering hers with a warmth that steadied the frantic rhythm of her heart. "You're not alone here," he said, and the quiet certainty of his words pierced deeper than any gesture could have. That was when Clara crumbled entirely, leaning into him, as though her body had been waiting for permission to let go. Clayton wrapped his arms around her carefully, almost reverently, holding her as though she were precious and breakable, as though her pain wasn't a burden but something he wanted to help her carry. The storm outside roared, lightning cracking the sky open. But inside the small cabin, there was only the steady rise and fall of his breathing against her cheek and the soft way he whispered, "I've got you. I promise. I've got you." She didn't know when she had last felt so safe, so wanted, not out of pity, but out of a quiet, growing tenderness that filled the spaces she thought grief had permanently hollowed out. And as the storm raged on, Clara realized that maybe fate hadn't abandoned her after all. Maybe it had placed her exactly where she needed to be, held in the arms of a man who understood brokenness but chose, again and again, to offer comfort instead of running from it. Clara Mayer's world had shrunk to the creak of wagon wheels and the sound of her own labored breathing as she forced herself forward along the dusty trail, her hands raw on the worn wooden handle and her pregnant belly tightening painfully beneath her faded calico dress. The sun beat down with relentless cruelty, turning the earth into shimmering waves of heat. But she refused to stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the fresh mound of dirt that held her husband, the man she'd buried barely a week earlier. Her legs trembled, her back throbbed, and with every step, fear gnawed at her, fear of giving birth alone, fear of starving, fear of failing the child beneath her heart. She whispered promises to the baby, shaky little vows that they would survive somehow, even though she didn't believe them anymore. When the wagon hit a rut, nearly jerking her off her feet, she let out a broken gasp that dissolved into tears she had been trying for days to hold back. She didn't hear the horse approach behind her, not until the ground darkened beneath a widening shadow. Startled, she whipped around, breath catching as she saw him, a tall cowboy with broad shoulders, dust coating his boots, and eyes the color of a storm rolling in across the plains. His gaze was on tea, cold or prying it, was filled with something that startled her even more than his sudden appearance. Concern, genuine, unguarded concern. For her. For a stranger. He didn't ask who she was, or what she was doing alone, on a trail meant for wagons drawn by teams, not pulled by trembling widows with swollen bellies. He didn't question her pride or her desperation. He didn't even ask permission. He simply stepped closer, voice firm but warm, and said the words that hit her like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "You, coming with me." She tried to protest, tried to cling to the thin thread of independence she'd been gripping since the moment she lowered her husband into the earth. But her throat tightened, and her knees buckled before she could form the words. The world blurred, spinning in and out of focus, and she felt herself falling until strong arms caught her, steady and sure, as if he had been waiting just for that moment. As he lifted her effortlessly against his chest, she felt the safety she hadn't allowed herself to feel since before tragedy struck. the scent of leather and dust, and something clean wrapped around her, grounding her even as her mind floated in exhaustion. She wanted to protest again, to insist she didn't need rescuing, but deep down, in the aching place where grief lived, she knew she did. And for the first time in weeks, Clara May let herself lean into someone else, surrendering to the strength of a stranger whose voice, just for simple words, had cracked open the door to a future she'd stopped believing could exist. Clara woke slowly, drifting up through layers of exhaustion, until she realized she was lying in a soft bed with a quilt tucked around her, the scent of pine wood, and something warm biscuits, filling the small room. For a long moment she didn't know where she was, and panic fluttered in her chest until memory returned in a rush. The trail, her legs giving out, and the cowboy's strong arms catching her. She sat up too quickly, the room spinning, and her hand instinctively moved to her belly as if to shield her unborn child from whatever dangers might come next. But when her vision steadied, she saw the room was simple and clean, with a small vase of wildflowers placed by the window, as though someone had tried to bring a touch of gentleness into a hard world. Outside the door, she heard the low clink of dishes and the deep, steady voice of Clayton Reed talking to his horse as if it were a friend, and something inside her loosened. She slipped her aching feet to the floor, bracing against the wall, as she made her way to the doorway, only to halt at the sight of him standing at the stove, large hands moving carefully as he flipped biscuits from a pan onto a plate. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes softening when they met hers, and he straightened immediately, wiping his hands on a towel, as though he needed to prepare himself to speak to her. "You're safe here," he said quietly, and the sincerity in those 3 words nearly brought her to tears all over again. He gestured to the table, but made no move to touch her or guide her, giving her space, giving her choice, something she hadn't had in so long. She sat gingerly, feeling strangely self-conscious under his gentle watchfulness. He poured her a cup of tea and set it near her, without pushing it into her hands, as though afraid any force would frighten her away. She noticed the tiredness beneath his eyes, the shadows that hinted he carried his own grief, his own ghosts, and she was struck by the realization that this quiet, rugged man had taken her in not out of pity, but out of a deep-rooted instinct to protect, an instinct that seemed to come from a place scarred by loss. When she tried to thank him, her voice cracked, but he only shook his head and murmured, "You don't owe me anything." Still as the warmth of the food settled in her empty stomach, and the walls of his cabin held her in a cocoon of safety, she hadn't felt in months. Clara couldn't shake the sense that this man, this stranger, was already changing the direction of her life, pulling her off the road of loneliness she had been stumbling down, and placing her gently into a place where her heart could finally rest, even if just for a moment.